My name is Martin Blinder. I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I've been asked to say a bit about my background. Graduated from Cornell University and the Chicago Medical School. Interned at San Francisco General Hospital. Then took a psychiatric residency at UCSF, including 2 fellowships in Europe. One at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, a second at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. I then returned to San Francisco for a 4th year of training, specifically a fellowship in legal or forensic psychiatry. I'm an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at UC, and for 17 years was adjunct professor of law at Hastings. We're going to talk today about head injuries, and specifically the damage to the brain that results from head injury, with particular emphasis on what they call euphemistically minor brain injury. A typical scenario might be something like this. Middle-aged man, let's say he's an engineer, leaves for work one morning, and about 15 minutes out, gets involved in a highway accident. A truck rams his sedan at great speed and throws him into the car in front. When the ambulance people come and finally pry him out of his vehicle, he doesn't seem to be that terribly injured. He's got some cuts and bruises. He's got a bump on the back of his head. He's dazed. But he seems to be pretty well intact. Still, out of an excess of caution, they take him to the ER where they, out of an excess of caution, do a comprehensive neurological exam, maybe some CAT scans, an MRI of the brain. Seems to be fine. They keep him for a few more hours, and then in the afternoon say, call your wife, have her take you home. You're going to be just fine. Only it turns out he's not just fine. As he first discovers when he gets back to work later that week, and sees that he can do all the old tasks he's always had to do with ease, but has tremendous problems doing anything new. A new computer system is put in that week, and this man who used to be a computer whiz is absolutely flustered and unable to master it. In the rest of his life, most striking is his memory deficits, particularly short-term memories. He's always misplacing his keys, can't find his wallet. Twice he even got lost driving to a familiar restaurant that he and his wife had been going to for years. He just gets completely disoriented. He starts to overdraw his checkbook, and this is the guy who was always meticulous to the last penny. Also, a striking personality change. He seems now irritable all the time. Things are always bothering him. Lights seem too bright. Noises seem too loud. Even the sound of his own children playing. In fact, previously a doting father, he's now lashing out at them in an uncharacteristic way. And lashing out at his wife as well. They previously had a very congenial relationship, and now he's always on her case. They once enjoyed a robust sexual life. That seems to have been frittered away. His libido is gone. And he's just very, very difficult to live with. Indeed, as his wife tearfully tells her divorce lawyer 2 years later, he left that morning one man and came back later that day another. And that, I think, is the unique thing about these head injuries, even so-called minor head injuries. Probably the most personal of personal injury litigation, because of how it can leave someone physically intact, their life expectancy unimpaired, and yet their lives have changed dramatically and very much for the worse. They leave home one day and come back the next, a stranger. I suppose it isn't too difficult to calculate and agree with opposing counsel the approximate worth of a lost limb. But how do you value a lost mind? What sum of money can ever replace who he was? We're going to begin by looking at the 6 basic kinds of damage you can have to the head. with particular focus on those who, as I say, change people forever, that don't necessarily involve the loss of motor function or sensory function, but do cause cognitive impairment, emotional changes, how these people relate to their intimates, their essential being, perhaps their very souls. All these can be changed profoundly, irrevocably, forever. The first clinical entity is the fractured skull. And interestingly, if the skull fractures, there may be no brain injury whatever, because the skull, by fracturing, absorbs most of the energy of the blow. A few weeks ago, my son had his Apple laptop in an attaché case, and the attaché case got run over. Don't ask. The case was shattered. The computer was totally intact. When I was 6 years old, I fell from a second-story window, landed on my head, and my dad, also a physician, looked at those x-rays of that skull fracture and thought his son was a goner, but here I am. So there is, in a sense, a benefit to fracturing your skull, and that takes the punishment. This is why some people will walk away from automobile accidents where their car is totaled. The car, by crumpling, spared them crumpling. The second clinical entity is that of concussion, which simply means shock. And here you will get symptoms very often. Concussion is theoretically a reversible injury, but not death to the brain cells. So theoretically, the symptoms are reversible, and they are, first and foremost, at least a brief period of unconsciousness. Although lately we realize you don't necessarily have to actually be knocked out. You can just be dazed and befuddled for 15, 20, 30 minutes. That's good enough. You've had a concussion. There are no focal neurological signs, but what you do get is headache, dizziness, impaired concentration, impaired memory, particularly recent memory, difficulty learning new material, impaired sleep, depression, and irritability. You can get the same symptoms from a whiplash-type injury, which will briefly cut off the blood supply to the brain and, in effect, cause an anoxic shock. Interestingly, neurological testing and visualizing studies are always negative. There are no focal signs, so you're not going to get any abnormal findings on the neurological exam, either motor, sensory, or reflexes. And the x-rays, the MRIs, the CAT scans are always going to be negative. Again, because there's nothing localized for them to focus upon. I'll say more about that problem in a minute. Recent studies indicate, however, that despite relatively benign objective findings, concussions may not be nearly as benign as we first thought. That, in point of fact, they can cause considerable enduring damage, that it's critical that these people get as much rest as if you broke your leg, and most particularly, people who get one concussion almost invariably get another. And you don't have to be a soccer player, a football player, or a boxer. There's something about people who are prone to concussions. They usually come in pairs and trios, and you can get cumulative damage. So the third concussion may be less damaging objectively than the first, but after the third one is when all these symptoms really become apparent. The third clinical entity is contusion, which is the doctor's fancy word for bruise. Once again, you can get this through a whiplash injury, and it's what happens when the brain rattles around inside the skull. You're going at 70 miles an hour, the car comes to a sudden halt, including your skull, but your brain keeps going, and it bangs up against there, and then it bounces back and forth from what we call a contra-coup injury, so that you may be struck in the back of your head, but the injury to the brain is the frontal lobes, because it bounces on the other side. With contusion, you always have a loss of consciousness. It can extend for several hours, even days. Almost invariably, you'll get abnormalities on a neurological exam, motor and sensory changes. A much greater likelihood of visualizing brain damage on MRIs, CAT scans, and even EEGs will show some abnormality. And the reason you get abnormality here is that the damage is localized, unlike the concussion, which spreads throughout the brain, and another kind of injury we'll be talking about that's much more serious in a moment. All visualizing studies depend upon contrast between pathology and normal tissue. A mammogram doesn't so much identify there's a brain tumor. A chest x-ray doesn't identify lung cancer in a smoker. What it identifies is that there's an area being photographed that has different densities than the surrounding tissue. And it is that contrast that enables the radiologist to say we've got some pathology there. If there isn't any contrast, it doesn't matter how much pathology is there, the visualizing media will not pick it up. Well, you're going to get contrast with contusion because there is certain areas of the brain that get affected. The fourth clinical concept is a laceration of the brain. Here you get not just bruising but scraping and tearing. The effects are very similar to those of contusion, but they're more serious. Fifth, and here I want to spend some time, is called diffuse axonal injury or diffuse internal injury. Have you seen pictures of brain cells? They're long fibers with a little bump at either end. Quite long. They can be maybe 3, 4, 5 inches long. And you've got a head injury with a sudden deformation of the brain inside the skull, which will stretch and tear many of these fibers throughout the brain tissue. So like concussion, it's diffuse. And you're not likely to pick up much on the MRI or CAT scans. But you can imagine, because the damage is throughout the brain in its entirety, its effects can be quite profound. Worse, as these brain cells are damaged, they leak. And the leakage causes damage to adjacent nerve cells that might not have been originally affected. So you get an immediate problem and then a substantial enduring problem that can be profoundly disabling. It is this diffuse internal brain injury that causes the greatest cognitive and personality changes, with greater long-term impact upon a patient's life than even the neurological deficits that might result if you stabbed somebody right through the skull. Obviously, such an event would be unwelcome, but the damage probably less severe than these diffuse injuries throughout the brain. Unfortunately, it is these folks who tend to get short shrift from both my profession and yours, because it's hard to really identify how seriously disabled they are. Finally, we have cerebral hemorrhage. Now, actually, in trauma, most of the bleeding is not in the brain itself, but in the three layers, the linings, the coverings, if you will, the arachnoid covers, epidural, subdural. These can bleed very easily. These are rich with veins. They get torn by the movement of the head, and then blood starts to accumulate between the brain and the skull, and it can happen over a period of weeks. So at first the person seems okay, and they go home, and about 3 or 4 days later they get a little sleepy, and it's not just that they had a great lunch, but rather that blood is beginning to impress itself on the brain, and you've got to get them to the hospital, open up the skull, and clean up that clot. Less common, but almost invariably lethal, is hemorrhage within the brain itself. In effect, they have a stroke. One other thing, you can get cerebral edema, cerebral swelling. Edema is our word for swelling, with almost any of these head traumas. It happens about 24 hours after the initial impact. So the person may go home, feel fine, and then wake up the next morning and they're having trouble getting out of bed. After the brain has been damaged, it swells. This is what happens when you have trauma. You get swelling. Imagine, remember the last time you sprained an ankle, and it didn't look too bad. The next day you couldn't get that ankle into your shoe. But you see, you can always leave your shoe off. The brain, on the other hand, has no place to go. That skull isn't going to give. And that cerebral edema can be fatal, which is why, again, back to the hospital and you drill holes in the person's skull, relieve the pressure. Let us now turn from cause to effects. And I find it convenient to group the effects of brain injury into 4 categories. I think it's important that you also see them in this way, divide them in this way, and present each category separately to the jury or to the trier, because each category is compensable in and by itself. So don't lump them all together. The first category are the neurological or physical deficits. Here is where you have motor weakness, maybe even paralysis, areas of numbness. You get changes in the cranial nerves, the eyes, the ears, the nose, and so on. What they call cranial nerve deficits. In other words, the brain's ability to record what it is that's going on around it. And the most sensitive of these defects is smell. Almost every patient that I have examined that's had any head injury of any significance complains of a loss of sense of smell. That may be their only physical symptom. It's their most sensitive thing. Now, there can be other difficulties as well. Difficulties with vision. You can get double vision. Difficulties with hearing and balance, dizziness, certainly intractable headaches, loss of sex drive. They may be hypersensitive to light, hypersensitive to sounds. And interestingly, a lot of people at this stage in their head injury find that they are intolerant to alcohol. That half a drink will do what it used to take 4 drinks to do. Obviously, in severe cases, the physical damage can be so great that you get paralysis, blindness, even death. A certain percentage of individuals apparently make full recovery, and then 3 or 4 years later develop epilepsy, because they've got a little scarring where the injury was and it healed. But that scar gives off cerebral activity at different rates than normal tissue. Once again, you get that contrast. And that aberrant, that ectopic source of electrical conductivity can trigger a seizure. And finally, and this is the most recent information we have on these head injuries, people who have had a substantial head injury as young people and apparently made full recovery are much more prone to early senility than those without such misfortune. Alzheimer's usually strikes in the 7th decade of life, but people who have had injuries can look forward to beginning to develop Alzheimer's as early as age 50. So between the epilepsy and the promise of early senility, we have grounds, I think, for asking for protective awards, even for people who apparently, in the moment, have made good recovery. One other thing that I find to be a very sensitive test of physical impairment, and that is what they call the cheek hand test. If I took a little piece of Kleenex or a piece of cotton, asked you to close your eyes, put your hands on the chair, and while you had your eyes closed, I simultaneously stroked your cheek and then the top of your other hand. I did that 3 times, and maybe rotate a little bit. Ask a person without any minor brain injury, what did you just feel? And they'll say, "Oh, doc, I felt you stroked my cheek and you stroked the top of my hand." A person who has minor head injury will be neurologically negative, except that they only feel one sensation and not the other. Usually they feel the one on the cheek, but not the one on the hand. So it's a very sensitive test. You can even do it in your office. You can practice medicine a little bit, which I know you've always wanted to do. So, loss of sense of smell and flunking the hand-cheek test are the most sensitive indices I know of physical examples of true brain injury, even in the face of otherwise objective normal findings. The second group of effects are the cognitive ones. Impairment of your ability to think. Particularly short-term memory suffers. Long-term memory may be retained. The person remembers every detail of a transatlantic voyage they took in 1957, but forget that they were in your office 2 days ago. Memory can be visual, so that the person, or impairments of memory can be, let me start that sentence again. There may be impairment of visual memory, so people tend to get lost. They can't remember where they put their keys. Or there may be impairment of semantic memory, where they can't remember what they just read, they can't remember names, they have trouble finding the correct word, they stumble in their sentence structure. Another common cognitive effect is loss of the ability to concentrate. You send these folks for neuropsychological testing, they do very well. And why not? The office is as quiet as this room today, and the person can sit in this quiet psychologist's office with its panels and stuffed chairs and focus on the test. Then they go back to the office with the phone ringing and the secretary pulling on one sleeve and their assistant pulling on the other, and they find that they can't get anything done because they can't concentrate in a real world situation, even though they do pretty good in the artificial world of the psychological testing. Because the cognitive centers are also the seat of language, they do have trouble with speech. They use the wrong words, they can't find the right words, they stumble around. They exhibit decreased processing speed. It takes them much longer to do things that they used to do with ease, and new material, as I indicated before, can often be tremendously challenging. I have a mechanic, a new patient, an auto mechanic, and he can do all the cars he always used to do, but with a new car, with a new manual, and now these automobiles are so complicated, they all come with 200-page manuals, he can't do them. Give him an old Chevy, no problem. Here's an interesting symptom. There's a loss of insight. They may be the last ones to appreciate how severe is their cognitive losses. They may be the last ones to appreciate that they've made a terrible social faux pas. Now, I often wonder about this guy, Imus, if he's got some kind of brain damage, because he says things which a normal person would be aware would be exceedingly hazardous and, to say the least, in poor taste. And you find this in people who previously were punctilious in their manners, and now they're saying things inappropriately, and they don't know it. If they knew it, they wouldn't do it. As for their cognitive losses, you've got to speak to the spouse to really get a handle on just how severely impaired they are. Because one of the most sensitive things you lose awareness of when you have loss of cognitive awareness is your own cognitive impairment. They have tremendous problems making long-term plans because it's hard for them to keep all the different parts of the connections in one place. Think about when you're planning a trip and you've got to remember about getting the rental car and canceling the newspapers and getting the tickets and the frequent flyer miles and all these things. And people with brain damage, even though they're bright, they can't keep all the balls in the air, you see. They can only keep one ball in the air. They exhibit perseveration from the word persevere. By that we mean that once they get going on a certain path, they can't deviate. They just keep going. They don't have the flexibility to adjust to new situations. A lower life animal, when confronted with a barrier in an experimental test, will just try and go through the barrier, whereas a higher level, like a mammal, will after a while figure out maybe going under it or around it. But people with brain damage just keep banging away at that. They'll weed the same patch in the garden 3 times. They'll read the same paragraph in a novel 3 times. When you take the LSATs, they tell you when you come to a really hard question, don't sit there and spend the whole time struggling with that question. Skip it. Finish the test. If you've got time, go back to the ones that stumped you. Well, a person with minimal brain damage can't do that. They'll get stuck on question 13, and they'll keep hitting at question 13 until their time is gone. And just as I gave you what I thought were the most sensitive indices to physical damage, let me give you my favorite the most sensitive indice to cognitive impairment. That is, they lose that sense of humor. See, one of the things that you lose most sensitively as part of this cognitive impairment is the ability to grasp abstractions. People with brain damage tend to get quite literal, quite concrete. One of my patients was working in his garden on Saturday afternoon when he received an invitation to come to an ad hoc party that night. And, just come as you are. And so he did. He showed up at this party at 8 o'clock at night in his garden clothes covered with dirt, because it said, come as you are. So that literal concreteness, as opposed to seeing the abstraction implied in the suggestion, come as you are, which means it's an informal gathering. If you ask somebody with brain damage, what does it mean people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones? And they'll say, well, the glass will break. They have difficulty, as I say, getting beyond the words and into the level of abstraction, which is the source of all humor. A man walks into a bar, sits down, orders a drink, takes a sip, and he hears a voice saying, my God, that's a lovely tie. And he looks around. He's alone in the bar, except for the bartender down at the other end. He can't figure it out. Sits there, finishes his drink. He hears a voice say, that's a lovely Rolex watch you have. My goodness, I've never seen such a nice watch. Calls the bartender over and he says, I keep hearing these voices saying all these nice things about me. I don't see anybody. Bartender says, oh, that's the peanuts. They're complimentary. Terrible joke. But such humor as there may be rests on your ability to juxtapose instantly two disparate abstractions. Peanuts as flattering as opposed to peanuts that are free. And it's a juxtaposition of two incongruous abstractions that is the source of many jokes, why we laugh. Well, a person with minimal brain damage who can't handle abstractions certainly can't handle two, and they won't get that joke. And they won't tell jokes because, again, you can't tell a joke that you yourself don't get. So, again, I find that even when they pass muster in most other cognitive tests, you ask their spouse, what happened to the sense of humor? And they'll say, gone. The third category of brain damage effects, and again, my focus here is primarily on the subtle cases. The big cases where someone half his brain is blown away, you don't need me. The defense is only too happy to settle. But I'm talking about the cases where you're going to have a fight. And here, very often, more important than the physical effects and the cognitive impairment is the third category. It's emotional effects. Eminently compensable, and yet this is the symptoms that are most often missed by doctors and attorneys alike. They can be very marked adverse personality changes. Head injuries will cause people's emotional stability to be upended. They'll burst into tears with little provocation, fly into rage with frustration. You'll see loss of ambition, like they've been smoking marijuana all day for years. Loss of initiative, loss of empathy. Again, that spouse will say, he doesn't get me anymore. He's like living with a robot. Loss of tolerance. As I say, loud sounds or even the kids that are banging around. You may see, in some cases, evidence of paranoia, where they misinterpret the effects of their own brain injury. So rather than saying, sweetheart, I notice at work I'm not really doing as well as I did before the accident. Instead of that, they'll say, since the accident, they've all become really critical of me, very demanding. I think they're trying to get me fired. They're making all these excessive demands. That paranoid misinterpretation, a very common effect of minimal brain damage. Weeks, maybe months later, depression can set in. As a person becomes aware, however dimly, of their loss of mental capacity, the changes in their lifestyle, the activities they once enjoyed now gone by the boards, perhaps their career has been compromised, even a loss of their basic identity, their companionship, so that people who initially seem to be doing relatively well, all of a sudden now it hits them that they're not the person they once were. They realize that they can do routine things, but new stuff is beyond them, and it hits them really hard. The commonest cause of depression is loss, and these people have suffered a true, profound, narcissistic loss. So, when it comes to the emotions, head injury has an incubation period, just like other ailments do. It's usually 2 to 3 days after someone has sneezed in your face that you'll develop the symptoms of a cold. Well, psychiatric conditions, too, have a long-term effect and have an incubation period so that you don't really know how severely disabled this person will be until a substantial passage of time. Finally, my last emotional symptom is, again, I think, almost the sine qua non of the head injury case. It's unique to the head injury case. That these people have lost the capacity to dream. They don't dream anymore. Again, they may be functioning pretty well in other respects, but for some reason the capacity to dream is the most sensitive indice I know that something has gone awry in the anatomical portions of the brain that deal with feelings. The last category of brain injury effects are what I would call the global effects, looking at the whole patient or the whole plaintiff. These people suffer not just a loss of skills, a loss of income, adverse personality changes, but they now live in a smaller, flatter world. Their lives are constricted, they lose choices. They suffer what we call in my trade anhedonia, a loss of pleasure, that things that would ordinarily be pleasurable, that in fact were pleasurable, no longer give them much joy. So their lives sort of flatten out. An example would be a woman I saw a year ago. Her name was Marcia Brown. She was really a bright, high-energy go-getter. Came from, shall we say, a poor choice of parents, but rose above her familial liabilities and got herself a good education and made a good marriage. Is in an automobile accident, no injuries except bam to her head. And now, all the changes that I described, and she's totally dependent on her husband. No more individual initiative. Used to love cooking new recipes and now can barely cook at all. Used to love to play the piano, used to be able to play by ear. She can still read the notes, but she's lost the ability to play by ear. Very difficult to make any choices because she can't see the difference in the options. Her marriage is in serious difficulty. She has no sex drive, much just sits around and eats and watches television. So, clearly, these events affect not just your client, but their whole family. Imagine the impact on this woman's spouse and children, or conversely, my engineer, and what happened to his wife and children when he changed. I think this transcends the possibility of a loss of income. Let me give you a few clinical syndromes, some terms that you're going to see in the records all the time. Most of you are old hands with this, so I may not be telling you anything new, but out of a desire to be complete. The term dementia. Dementia refers to a chronic, irreversible impairment of mental faculties. There is a diminished commerce with reality. It's like a veil has come down between these folks and the rest of the world. And once you have dementia, you never get better. You can get worse, you may stay the same, but you don't get better. That's part of the definition. Permanent. Postconcussive syndrome. When we talked about concussion, syndrome simply means a collection, a constellation of symptoms, and post means after. So post-concussive syndrome would be the symptoms which follow concussion, like post-traumatic stress disorder follows the combat experience. Post-concussive syndrome is defined as the mental impairment and emotional disorder characterized by personality change, difficulty concentrating, memory deficits, particularly short-term, headaches, dizziness, irritability, emotional volatility, depression, anxiety, and fatigue. It has both organic and psychological components. And clearly, you have to look at who this individual is that developed these symptoms, because they're going to affect different people differently. Maybe a janitor can continue functioning just as well even with all these symptoms. A neurophysicist with minor brain injury probably will see the end of his career. So what matters is not only the degree of head injury, but the number of college degrees held by the person whose head was injured. The third definition is organic personality, and that again is the stranger who comes home from the hospital, and how different they are. They're depressed and irritable and hypersensitive and maybe a little paranoid. And their pathology ranges from paranoia to complete apathy. From a loquacious profanity in someone who never before used a swear word to utter silence. You see loss of insight, empathy, loss of social awareness. There may be some inappropriate conduct. These people are very, very different. I talked earlier about depression as a very common late effect of head injury. The suicide rate in people with head injuries is very high. All right, that's the overall picture. Now, how do you as attorneys go about assessing the severity of a head injury case that's come across your desk? What are these cases worth, and how do you arrive at that determination? Well, after over 4 decades of clinical practice, I've come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as a minor head injury. An attorney, a plaintiff attorney friend of mine, was involved in a 20-mile-per-hour crash. He was in the passenger front seat, and his head cracked the windshield. Went to the hospital, was completely worked up, thoroughly, found nothing. But his practice has changed. He has become uncommonly dependent upon staff for getting the essence out of depositions. He used to read them himself. He still does, but they got to summarize them for him to make sure he meets all the deadlines. He never used to have a problem making deadlines, but if they're not on his tail, he misses deadlines. And most important, great trial attorney, he's lost his flexibility. I talked about that perseveration in court. If he gets stuck on direct examination with a question that's constantly objected to and the objections are sustained, he can never come up with alternative ways of dealing with it. He can't seem to discriminate one juror from another. He has a sort of boilerplate way of responding to all jurors. If there are any surprises during the course of his case, he can't go with the punches anymore. The one thing a good trial attorney has to have is his ability to think on his feet in the moment. He can do all the old stuff, like the old horse and the fire trucks, but new routes, new things, these throw him. He's a senior partner. His job is probably not in jeopardy, but he's certainly not the attorney that he used to be. And this is with minor brain injury. So I guess whether or not a minor brain injury occurs, it depends on who it happens to. If it happens to you, it's not a minor brain injury. Cross-examination. Doctor, you said in your report this is just a minor brain injury. Yeah, it's a minor brain injury because it happened to him, my patient. If it happened to me, it would be really serious because, for one thing, I probably wouldn't be here on the stand today. I couldn't function. So when a doctor says it's a minor brain injury, say, Doc, suppose you had it. Would it be a minor brain injury? Well, I don't know. In that case, there was a study of some patients who were knocked out for a few minutes that revealed that months later, 95% of them were still having symptoms of fatigue, lightheadedness, dizziness, depression, irritability, problems with memory and concentration. In another study, a British study, it showed that nearly all workers who were diagnosed with minor head injury did go back to work. Maybe that's one criteria for distinguishing minor from major head injury. Minor head injury go back to work, but at least a third of them, though they held on to their jobs, did uncharacteristically poorly. Sudden problems with discipline, with attendance, punctuality, shoddy work habits, irritability, difficulty getting along with their fellow workers. They usually ended up relegated to lower levels of responsibility. So, another problem in assessing severity is, remember, the plaintiff may be the last one to realize how severely injured he is. He's in denial. Part of that is organic. They lose judgment. They don't see, they don't hear the same things everybody else does about them. But it may also be psychological. They have difficulty in acknowledging they're not the man, they're not the woman they once were. Remember also that the visualizing studies may be negative in the most severe cases because the whole brain is involved, ergo you don't get the contrast needed for a positive MRI or a CAT scan. Well, what about neuropsychological testing? That was supposed to be the new thing. Now we finally have a gold standard for quantifying with these tests that somebody has X degree of brain damage, like in workers' comp. This person has a 16.5% injury or disability. I never know how doctors arrive at a 16.5% disability, but we're supposed to do that. So these neuropsychological tests, the Halstead, the Wright-Tan, are supposed to quantify that. Now we're really scientists. Well, what happens? The plaintiff's neuropsychologist indeed finds objective evidence of brain injury of some severity. The defense neuropsychologist, ostensibly running the same test, doesn't seem to find very much, and what he finds is an old injury. It's when he fell off out of that window when he was 6 years old. That's what that is, you see. So they kind of tend to cancel each other out. Well, maybe I should say a couple of words about testing. There are three kinds of psychological tests: objective, projective, and neuropsych. The objective tests are the typical pen and paper tests like an IQ test or MMPI, where the patient's answers are collated and then matched against an enormous number of controls. And despite the word objective, again, all right, let's say your brain injury case tests with an IQ of 130. That's a little higher than the average attorney, so that's pretty good, right? But suppose he had an IQ of 160 the day before the accident. The test isn't going to tell you that. The test is just a snapshot. It's not a moving picture. Projective tests are where the individual projects their own impressions onto the test material. The Rorschach test. What do you see in this ink blot? Or the TAT, which is 20 ambiguous photographs that the person is supposed to interpret. A man is sitting there on the edge of a bed looking down, and a woman is lying behind him in the bed with a sheet over her bosom. What do you see in this story? Oh, well, he's about to leave for Iraq, and they're both very sad. Or they tried to have sex, but he wasn't equal to the task. Obviously, the picture is ambiguous. The person is reading into that picture, and apparently these interpretations can be scored and give you a diagnosis. And finally, we have the neuropsych tests, which ostensibly measure coordination, judgment, memory, all the cognitive impairment issues that can be so devastating to the head injury case. So we can't genuflect before any of these tests. They give you the results in precise numerical terms, which gives juries a sense that, why, this is science, this must be accurate. But they're about as objective as the neuropsychologist performing the examination. So they are a tool. Like all laboratory tests, they're a tool, but they are not the diagnosis, and they are certainly not the biological reality of a living, breathing human being. So much for tests. Well, okay. Let's look at some things we can measure easily, like the damage to the car, the force of the accident. Is there a good correlation there between the objective damage and the degree of disability? Well, unfortunately, no. General George Patton survived numerous tank battles in World War II without a scratch and died with a broken neck in a Buick in 1945 that was going at 7 miles per hour when it crashed into a tank. So that's really not a good objective, and we talked earlier about how the vehicle can absorb a lot of the punishment and the person is relatively spared. There is somewhat better correlation between the presence of neurological signs on the day of the accident, the length of memory loss, the depth of the amnesia, the period of unconsciousness. There is a better correlation. But even here it's a little iffy. People can be in comas for 3 weeks and then emerge and apparently have no brain damage, whatever. We used to think that the best measure of how much damage someone was going to suffer was how long they were out cold. And you ask somebody, were you unconscious? And they say, yeah, I think so. Well, how long were you out? Well, how are they supposed to know? Because they weren't there. They were unconscious, So you'll see in the ambulance report, no apparent loss of consciousness. How do they know that? Well, what you also see is no loss of consciousness in the accident report, then brief loss of consciousness in the emergency room, then upstairs when they go into the ICU, they were unconscious for 3 days. By the time the case comes to trial, they were unconscious for a week. So again, here's another rule of thumb that goes out the window. I think, and of course this is my bias, that a psychiatric examination is a pretty useful tool in coming up with some hard data about the degree of disability. And in a psychiatric exam, we take the patient, client, plaintiff, if you will, from their earliest recollections right up to the present time, hitting all the obvious landmarks, family life, educational aspirations, work history, and so on. And particularly, I like to interview family members because the patient himself, as I've said, perhaps ad nauseum, may be the least reliable historian in reporting his own degree of disability. So it's tremendously important to talk to the spouse. So, Mr. Smith, how's your sex life since the accident? Oh, it's great, Doc, good as ever. And he leaves the room, and I talk to Mrs. Smith, and she says, Jack hasn't touched me in months. So you're going to get a better history from the spouse very often than you're going to get from your client. Also important are the 3 cardinal rules for working up any personal injury case. Rule number 1, get the past medical records. Rule number 2, get the past medical records. Rule number 3, get the past medical records. God bless it, there's so much information that you've got to have that can either strengthen or demolish your case, but better to find out before trial. Get the work records, get the high school records. You may find out that your 130 IQ client back in high school had an IQ of 160. Or alternatively, he washed out of the military because he was such a dummy. So the reason he's a dummy now, because he always was a dummy. And the military records will tell you that. He won't. And most important, as a psychiatrist, are the mental status examination. The mental status exam is like a psychological x-ray of the patient as he sits there before me, where I objectively assess the quality of his perceptual apparatus. Does he see and hear the same things the rest of us do? Is he alert? Is he aware? Is he out of it? Area number 2, mentation, his cognitive strength, memory, his ability to perform simple arithmetical computations in his head, his ability to spell. Can he remember 3 random words that I gave him 10 minutes before? Does he know the name of the Vice President of the United States? Does he grasp abstractions when I ask him to interpret everyday proverbs? The third component is affect or emotional tone. Is he anxious? Is he depressed? Is he agitated? Is he hostile? And lastly, behavior. Are there any unusual mannerisms, any tics, any aberrations of gait? And does his behavior fit his emotions? Somebody says, I feel fine, doc, and tears are streaming down his face. So you get that disparity between affect and behavior. Very significant. I do my hand-cheek test. I ask them how they're enjoying their dinner, and they say, food just doesn't taste good to me anymore. And then I know something they don't know, which is they've lost their sense of smell. I may run some tests. In fact, I almost invariably do because I know the other guy's going to do it. But a test is just a test. My next task is to ascertain whether or not this fellow is malingering. Remember, 95% of what we find in these head injury cases is subjective. It's what your client, my patient, is telling you. There aren't good objective tests. Remember, the MRIs and brain scans are probably going to be negative, but neuropsychs are going to cancel each other out. So when you depend upon what someone is telling you, the field is ripe for plaintiffs who aspire to a summarily higher standard of living and who are willing to fabricate a head injury case. And how do you distinguish those who are truly disabled from subjective symptomatology? Distinguish those from people who are pulling your leg. Well, fortunately, just as there are other patterns to pathology, there is a definite pattern to malingering. And I'm going to give you the list of red flags that should suggest to you that the person before you may not be real. And here I think we should take a little break. I think it's important that, given that malingering is implicit in all minimal injury cases, that you take the issue head on.
You take the what?
Take the issue head on. No pun intended. And the most striking thing about malingerers is that their complaints fit no clinical pattern with which I am familiar. They borrow one symptom from something they may have read about, another symptom from USA Today, another symptom from something they saw on television, a Hollywood movie here and there. So you've got this constellation of symptoms. And in true medicine, when you connect up symptoms with your pencil, you get a pattern. The motorcycle cop upside down on the tree, whatever it is. With a malingerer, you connect the symptoms, all you get is a squiggle on the page. So they don't hang together. So that's the first thing. This doesn't make any sense. Number two, within each symptom, there is incongruities. They'll typically complain of memory losses. But their memory losses are over the top. They can't remember their mother's maiden name. They don't remember where they went to high school. They have a very vivid memory of every detail of the accident and the defendant's acts of negligence. But, God forbid where they were dining last night, that they can't remember. Invariably, they will complain of being wiped out by this event, and they're terribly depressed, and yet they seem to have the energy to pursue their legal case with tenacity. They save lawyers a lot of time. They'll come to your office with all the files collated, and they'll have all the precedents and save you all kinds of time in the law library. They've got the energy to do that. They gild the lily. They have too many symptoms, whereas recall people with real head injuries tend to be in denial. They tend to play things down. You got to get the scoop from their spouse. Often their symptoms, though plentiful, are vague, and they keep them vague because they don't want to be tripped up in a contradictory memory loss. And they're very apprehensive about seeing a psychiatrist who they fear will psych them out. People with genuine psychiatric symptoms don't have to remember their symptoms because they are their symptoms. They live their symptoms, and their symptoms are with them day in, day out. The malingerer symptoms tend to come and go. They most particularly vary with the vicissitudes of the case. And the closer you get to trial, the sicker they get. People with genuine ailments, they may or may not improve, but they usually don't get sick as trial approaches. In fact, most people get better. It takes 3 years before this case comes to trial. By the time you finally pick a jury, they may be fine. I can assure you the malingerer will not be fine until the settlement, and then they're cured. So look for a plaintiff who's getting worse and worse and probably isn't real. I can easily lead malingerers to endorse improbable symptom pairs. They'll complain of headaches, and I'll say, you notice when you get really severe headaches that your hand starts to twitch? Oh, yeah, doctor, now you mention it, that's true. Whenever I get a headache, my hand starts to twitch. What headaches and twitching hands have to do, I don't know. But they'll go for it if you do it in a persuasive way. I've had malingerers who insist they're hearing voices ever since the accident. I keep hearing voices. I keep hearing the voice of the ambulance driver who took me out of the car. And so I ask him, are you right-handed or left-handed? And perhaps they'll allow that they're right-handed. In what ear do you usually hear the voices? And you can just see the wheels turning, and there's a long pause, as you're trying to figure out what the right answer should be. And more often than not, they'll go for it. Oh, well, mostly in the right ear, doc. Well, of course, auditory hallucinations are not in any ear. They're from outer space. They're from within your soul. But they're not localized like your right hands and your left hands. But the malingerers don't know that. People don't embark upon something as fraudulent as a malingered case from scratch. These people tend to be a little on the shady side to begin with. So you can often find evidence that they're not entirely straight in other aspects of their lives. Typically, they'll have 5 jobs in as many years and 6 different addresses. There's evidence of poor impulse control. These are the folks who tend to go through life leading a trail of broken hearts, heads, contracts, windows, laws. So doing a malingered head case is just another notch. You got to get the police records. You'll find domestic violence, child abuse, all kinds of nasty things. A couple of stays in rehab. It's rare that an individual has a clean slate and comes up with a malingered case. At the very least, you'll find they tend to be highly dependent upon family and friends, welfare, the VA. Malingerers will refuse partial employment or partial disability adjudications, whereas most people with genuine ailments would be thankful for anything. They want to get the case behind them. They'd be happy to get part-time work and finish the case. Malingerer, of course, wants to go for gold. Run an MMPI on malingerers, and they tend to over-endorse symptoms. They have too many symptoms, and they endorse the obvious indices of disability while missing the subtle nuances, the steps by which you would get to the greater disability. So they miss those, especially if endorsing them seem somewhat unflattering. They would not endorse what people with head injury do. I tend to duck my responsibilities, whereas the malingerer will endorse, I feel so depressed I'm absolutely useless. Now, you don't get to feeling absolutely useless. You have to go there by degrees, and one of the degrees is, I tend to duck my responsibilities. Well, see, the malingerer is going to miss that and just go for the advanced symptom. It's like somebody who says or who demonstrates that they can't even lift 30 pounds, but you get films of them lifting their sports car with one hand and putting the tire on with the other. How can they be able to lift 50 pounds but not lift 30? So that's what I'm saying about these tests. They miss the way stations, the transitional steps that these tests are designed to pick up, and go for the obvious gross ones. My weight's about the same, true or false? They might say true, but then they'll say, I have no appetite. Now, if you have no appetite, if that's real, you're going to lose weight. But see, they don't make those connections. So the MMPI, surprisingly, can be a good measure of whether or not someone's faking. I find malingerers are guarded during my examinations. I find them to be unpleasant. They're very difficult. They don't like this question. I'm going to call my lawyer and see if I have to answer that question. They're hostile individuals. And there's no reason for it. I have a baseline, even when I'm doing what I believe to be an adverse exam. I'm doing an IME. I'm doing a defense exam. And in 5 or 10 minutes, I'm able to get most examinees to be very happy to be in my office. I'm not the enemy. They see that very quickly. In fact, to defense counsel consternation, they'll sometimes say, you know, I really like that Dr. Blinder. Can he be my doctor? And they have to explain that I'm doing the defense exam. So if somebody is unpleasant and very suspicious about my questions, chances are they're covering something up. It's not me. Keep in mind, of course, that these are individual items. You've got to have a bunch of them. No single element on this list means you've got a malingerer, but certainly if you've got a whole bunch of them, you should be suspicious that maybe this case should go away. How do you best make use of a psychiatrist? I think we come in handy in that we can correlate all of this disparate information. We can bring it together in a few minutes like I did today and correlate the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, the impact on the family. We can tie it all together. We can even correlate adverse information that the other side might be bringing out. For example, the defense psychiatrist might say, he didn't have many complaints at all, and I can explain that that's characteristic of people with head injuries that are in denial. So it's a good way to sew things up. Depressed patients may be unable to speak convincingly of any single happy pre-accident event, and that's because they're depressed, and they see their whole lives through these mud-colored glasses. And I can explain again to the jury, you don't see much change in his attitude now versus before, but that's because he doesn't remember how wonderful his life was before. That's part and parcel of his disability. I can explain why symptoms are so much greater than the objective findings on x-rays and neurological exams, and I can put psychometric tests in perspective and show that they are not a moving picture, but simply a photograph. Since the issue of malingering is implicit in all these cases, I can take it head on and show how the pattern of this individual's symptoms, though highly subjective, do fall into a recognized clinical pattern, unlike the malingerers whose symptoms are all over the place. I would like to interview family and friends. I can work that in to my testimony. And perhaps the most important thing that any medical expert can do, in a plaintiff case at least, is carry most of the plaintiff's water. Jurors, I think, prefer stoics to supplicants when it comes to plaintiffs. And I can present the symptoms that the plaintiff has suffered and not sound like I'm whining and begging and pleading, because I'm objective. I wear this figurative white coat. So certainly they've got to meet the plaintiff, but better that you let your medical experts carry most of the symptoms. The jury will take it better, I think. When doing a defense IME, nothing is more important than those 3 rules, getting the past medical records. For one thing, so often is the case, I find symptoms, if not identical, then at least quite similar in the past medical records to the symptoms now being laid at the feet of the accident of issue. If you ask for all the medical records, you can sometimes get a whole box. And of course, they're all out of chronological order, or they're arranged according to hospital. And what I do is I meticulously take every piece of paper and I put it in chronological order. So I have a complete picture of this person from the age of 5 right up through to last week. And what a different picture emerges when you do it that way. And you can just see that the person is probably no worse off now than they were before, What has changed is the complexion of their symptoms, their form, but the actual volume, the degree of disability, is unchanged. It's like taking a balloon and you squeeze it, you can change the shape, but the volume of air remains the same. And so what may happen is the accident changed the shape of the balloon, but did not actually add to their actual degree of disability or impairment. Obviously, I'm very interested in all of the indicia of malingering. I'm interested in the progression of symptoms after the accident, and if they seem to be getting worse, every doctor they see adds another hour to their degree of unconsciousness. That is physiologically improbable. There's something going on. There's some kind of post-event contamination that is beginning to change the medical records. Whether I'm testifying for plaintiff or defense, I encourage the attorney to do a direct that has some edge to it, that has a bit of a challenge to it. If, let's say, I was testifying on behalf of Marcia Brown, the case I mentioned earlier, of the young wife and mother who's got this head injury, a question like this, I think, would be very useful. Doctor, you and others have testified the objective findings here are quite minimal. We really have mostly Marcia Brown statements as to what she can do and what she can't. How do we know she's really got an impairment? I mean, how do we know she's not making these things up? Doctor, we've all seen Marcia Brown sitting here in the courtroom, and she seems to be following very well what's going on. She testified beautifully the other day. Sounds very good. How is it possible that she could possibly be damaged to the degree that you testified to earlier? There's a cross-examination quality to that, but the juries are going to be really interested in the answer. I'd like to conclude my talk by giving you the answer I gave to that question. It went along the lines of pointing out that Marcia Brown is a young adult who started her life as a high achiever, a crummy childhood, but she rose above that, got herself an education, paid for it herself, has a lot of talent, used to play piano in a bar, found herself a good husband, had 2 wonderful children, had a very solid job, and then the accident. And now she's cognitively crippled. She can do those old tasks, but new ones are a real challenge. She reads, but doesn't remember half of what she's read. She's lost her sense of smell. And as her husband testified to, she's lost a lot of other sensual satisfactions. She just goes through the motions. In a sense, though she looks good, what you're seeing here is a shell of the kind of life she once led. Her once unlimited array of choices is now compromised by her severe intellectual losses and her emotional fragility. She's lost her capacity, her freedom, if not her right, to choose. Earlier in my testimony, I spoke of her loss of mental functions, memory, concentration, judgment, and reasoning. But there's a lot more to the mind than the ability to think. Because of this brain damage, she's lost her sense of self, her self-esteem, her sense of contentment, a feeling that she's got an occupation ahead of her, a career. She eats, but smells and tastes nothing. She acts, but then forgets what it is she has done. She sleeps, but she no longer dreams. Her universe has shrunk. Her world is now that of the mentally impaired. Her marriage is in trouble. I doubt very much if it fails, if she will ever find another husband. Her life really has come to an end. Her life expectancy is unchanged, but the life that she once knew ended with that accident. This is as far as she goes. She may indeed face a half-century of being alone. She will ever be dependent upon the kindness of those around her. And as she becomes increasingly aware of her losses, she is ever more susceptible to depression. As Sigmund Freud pointed out nearly 100 years ago, the best measures of well-being are the ability to enjoy work and to enjoy love. Prior to the accident, Marcia Brown had an extraordinary zest for both. But she now can never expect to be the wife and mother that she once was. She'll be working at menial jobs. Little by way of life's traditional joys remain to her. She is left with a near-forgotten past, a markedly restricted present, and precious little future. In short, in every sense, this accident has robbed Marcia Brown of her dreams. And on that somber note, I thank you for your kind attention. Any questions?
I do. I have one. Have you ever run across, or is there some way of just doing what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, a psychological malingerer? That is, that maybe they're not really injured that much, but they think they are, and they truly believe it. And even though it doesn't show up in the tests, they're convinced that they do have these injuries.
So your question is there a difference between a malingerer and somebody who may not, in fact, have a physical or a psychiatric ailment, but is so convinced that they do that for all practical purposes they are impaired? And the answer is, indeed, there is a difference. The malingerer is trying to fool you. The person with a genuine psychosomatic ailment that's purely functional is fooling himself. But in his mind, he or she, they're disabled. Their symptoms are real to them. And that's very different than somebody who knows perfectly well that they don't have any real symptoms but are conjuring up the case. And the person with real symptoms will pass my malingering test. Their symptoms, for example, will fall into a recognized psychiatric pattern. They'll be constant. They probably will improve with therapy. They won't get worse as trial approaches. And they certainly won't be cured when the jury issues its verdict. Also, people with true psychosomatic symptoms tend to be rather straight, a little obsessive, have good jobs, good family life. They care too much, in a way, and that's perhaps why they are susceptible to being disabled by these psychological symptoms. So I think there's a difference between conscious and unconscious deception. And the person with a true psychiatric disability may, in fact, be physically okay, but they are so persuaded that they are not, that they live the life of a cripple. Ergo, they are crippled. I had a cop who was testifying in court. He was an old-style cop, the kind that would shoot first and ask questions later, you know. He rarely, he had the Miranda card that cops carry, and I don't know if you've ever seen the Miranda card that cops carry. It's all wrinkled and dirty because, you know, it's all smudged, and it breaks their heart to get a new one. This guy's card was always pristine. He never had to read the rights to people he collared because they were always unconscious. He'd either shoot them or knock them down, so you'd have to read someone's rights if they're out cold. So he was a tough guy, and you know, he didn't join the force to serve humanity. He wanted to catch felons, and he had a great record. Till one day he's testifying, and a public defender catches him in a little fudging of the records there. And there on the stand, he suddenly has what we were all convinced was a heart attack. He has crushing chest pain, and off he goes to the ICU in an ambulance. And if you have any doubts about whether or not you had a heart attack, 20 minutes in an ICU with IVs in every limb and that oscilloscope registering your heartbeat. And I think they had a little power failure, and the oscilloscope went flat. He said, "Oh my God, my heart stopped." So this guy had reason to believe he had a heart attack. What he had was an anxiety attack, which can look like a heart attack. There's no way to persuade this cop that he had an anxiety attack. Officer Smith, your heart is sound. You can go right back to being a cop. Yeah, right, Doc. He wouldn't run after felons anymore. He would walk after them. You don't catch many felons if you're going to walk, you know. Stop. He really couldn't practice as a cop anymore, and after 6 months went on disability because he was afraid that any exertion would give him another heart attack. He certainly wouldn't go to court. And what good is a cop that won't go to court to identify the perp? So he had to wash out after 22 years on the force. He was a cardiac cripple with a perfectly sound heart. Trust me, his EKG was fine, his enzymes were fine. He was out of the ICU in 24 hours. He said, you know, your heart is sound as a dollar. But not in his mind. And if in your mind you've got an illness, you may live the life of somebody with that illness, and that illness is real to you. That's not malingering.
Did you testify for him?
I give testimony to the retirement board. I did a report. I happened to be in court the day he had his, quote, heart attack, testifying on some other aspect of the case. But I did write a report that he had a cardiac neurosis, we used to call him.